How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Guy in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, and I hope YouTube behaves on my end. Amen. Ella saying shalom. Joe in the Inland Empire. Tom in PA. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is page 104 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 that we opened yesterday. Here in chapter 9. So what is this? So if we have this idea that if you steal, if one robs, and then not only steals, but when he's challenged, he swears a false oath that he robbed, and then he wishes to atone. So normally when you wish to atone, you just make restitution. But because he swore the false oath, and this is specifically written in the Torah, so this halacha, this law, is doraisa, right, from the written Torah, he has to make restitution of the principal, add the fifth, right, which is a fifth of the total, the principal plus the penalty. So that's really like a fourth of the principal. And the Mishna said that he has to go to great lengths, right? He has to go to wherever the victim, the robbery victim is, and bring him the restitution, even if he has to travel a very long distance in order to do it. Now, what if the robbery victim says, listen, my friend is going to be in your city. I live far away. You can give him the money and he'll give it to me. So sounds like the robbery victim appointed an agent to receive the restitution and the penalty from the robber. And so that should count. Does it count? Not so fast. Let's read about it. A couple paragraphs from the top on 104a. The Mishnah teaches that if the robber wishes to return the stolen item, he may not give the payment to the robbery victim's son to return it to the robbery victim, nor to his agent. And the Gemara comments, it was stated with regard to an agent who was appointed in the presence of witnesses to collect a debt from another, that Rav Chisda said such an agent is a legally recognized agent, so that the debtor is considered to have repaid his debt as soon as he transfers the money to the agent, and the debtor will not be held responsible if an accident occurs causing the loss of the money before the agent gives it to the creditor. Rabbah said such an agent is not a legally recognized agent, and the debtor remains responsible until the money reaches the creditor's possession. So right away we have a host of issues. First of all, that dispute between Rav Chisda and Rabbah is about a debtor, right? Somebody who borrowed money and wishes to return it. So when has he officially returned the money? Okay, so if he returns it to the person he borrowed from, he officially returned the money. If he returns the money to that person's agent, well, how do we know it's that person's agent? Did he just say, yeah, I represent so-and-so, you can give me the money and I'll give it to him? Well, that person could just disappear. What if the principal, sends a note that's signed? Oh, we're going to discuss that. Now, what we said in our Mishnah, which is not about a debtor paying off a loan, but a robber who not only stole but then swore a false oath about it, that he has to make sure the money reaches the principal personally. And the one option that the Mishnah gave him is that he can give the money, if it's just impossible to get to where the robbery victim is, so the repentant robber can give it to an agent of the court. Okay, that makes sense, right? An official with the authority, the imprimatur of the court itself could receive the money. And that would seem to indicate that even an officially appointed agent of the robbery victim might not suffice. We'll see as we continue this discussion. Now what we're talking about is, well, what about an agent that is appointed by the creditor? And by extension, we're going to see, can the robbery victim appoint such an agent in front of witnesses? Right? So this is not an agent of the court, but it is somebody who was appointed to serve as an agent for the purpose of receiving a payment for his principal, and he was appointed in front of witnesses. So that's certainly a higher level of reliability. So let's see. Now, Rav Hista says an agent appointed in front of witnesses, yes, legal agent. Rabba says, no, that is not an agent that you can say with confidence, a debtor, right, making a repayment of a loan, he cannot say, well, I gave it to the guy's agent. That agent was appointed the agent of my creditor in front of witnesses. So when I gave the money to the agent, I paid off my loan. Rabba says no. Doesn't mean necessarily no, but it means you can't say you're done, right? There are conditions, there are circumstances in which you might not be done. It's not enough to say, I gave it to an agent that was appointed by witnesses, because we could come up with circumstances where, the money is not safely, you cannot say that the money will definitely for sure reach the creditor. So let's keep reading. Gemara explains their respective opinions. Rav Hista said that this agent who was appointed in front of witnesses is an agent because it was for this reason that the creditor took the trouble and appointed the agent in the presence of witnesses. Why did he do that? In order to place the matter under the agent's domain. He went to the trouble of appointing an agent in the presence of witnesses so that his agent could collect his debts for him. Right? He doesn't want to have to go hounding the borrower. His agent will do that. And he went to the trouble of appointing the agent in front of witnesses. Rabbah said that this man is not legally considered the agent because this is what the creditor is assumed to be saying to the debtor. This individual is a trustworthy person. If you are willing to rely on him, then rely on him to convey the payment to me. Similarly, if you wish to send the debt in his possession, then send it in his possession. So what Rabbah is saying is that in the presence of witnesses, the lender, the creditor, said to the borrower, this guy, he's trustworthy. So if you want to make him your agent to return money to me, I would recommend him. But you understand that the way Rabbah is interpreting this is that what the creditor was saying to the borrower, if you want to appoint this guy as your agent to send money to me at the time that you're going to repay the loan, he seems trustworthy. If it turns out that the guy absconds with the money or loses it, or for whatever reason the money doesn't make its way back to the lender at the time that the loan is being paid off, who bears the loss? The borrower, right? What we're talking about is, when is the loan considered to be repaid if there's a middleman for receiving the money? Rav Hizda would say that this agent who was appointed in front of witnesses to be the agent of the lender, once he receives the money in his hand from the borrower, it's as if the money has already been given to the lender. And if the agent loses it or absconds with it on the way back to the creditor, it's not the borrower's problem. He repaid the loan. Rabbah says, no. All that the creditor was saying is, this is a trustworthy person. You can have good faith in him that he'll return it, but he's your agent. And if the money doesn't get back to me, it's your loss, you, the borrower. Now, the Gemara cites a Mishna that poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Hizda, right? That an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses represents the one who appointed him. So we learned in a Mishna, tractate Bava Metzia, our next tractate, page 98b, With regard to one who enters into an agreement to borrow a cow from another, and the owner sent it to the borrower in the possession of his son, or in the possession of his own slave, or in the possession of his own agent, or if he sent it in the possession of the borrower's son, or in the possession of the borrower's slave, or in the possession of the borrower's agent. In all these cases, if the cow died before it reached the borrower is exempt from paying for the cow, as it never entered his possession. So, surprising that we're going to treat as equal cases that one who's going to lend a cow to a borrower and he's sending that cow by way of a middleman. And we're going to say that it's the same whether it's the lender's agent, the lender's slave, the lender's son, or the borrower's agent, the borrower's slave, or the borrower's son. In all these cases, we don't say that the borrower took possession of the cow until it reached him, and so since it never reached him, he is not legally liable for making good on this cow that died because he never got it. Surprising that we would say that that when the lender puts the cow in the possession, right, under the authority of the borrower's agent, slave, or son, that we don't say from that point on, okay, the borrower is responsible. But according to that Mishnah, no. So the Gemara explains the case of the Mishnah with regard to this agent of the borrower. What are the circumstances surrounding his appointment? If the Mishnah is discussing a case where he did not appoint him as his agent in the presence of witnesses, how do we know that he was appointed as an agent? Rather, it must be that it is a case where he appointed him as his agent in the presence of witnesses, and yet the Mishnah teaches that the borrower is exempt. So this poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Chisda, who holds that one acquires property through his agent if that agent was appointed in the presence of witnesses. According to his reasoning, the borrower should be held responsible for the cow once it reaches the possession of his agent. And the Gemara answers, it is as that which Rav Chisda said concerning a different Mishnah. This is stated with regard to his hired hand or his regular harvester. No, we're not talking about an agent who was appointed in the presence of witnesses to be a legal agent who could receive possession of property that was being conveyed to this person, in this case, the borrower of a cow. Rather, it's somebody who's known to be an employee of the borrower. So you know that this guy works for the borrower, so you might think, okay, this guy works for the borrower, everyone knows he works for the borrower, here, take the cow, bring it to your boss. Did you legally convey the cow to the borrower? No, because who knows, the borrower might have never agreed to appoint his hired hand, his cashier at a store that he owns in order to receive a cow and take care of it and transport it to where the borrower is. He's not the right guy for that. The lender has no reason to assume, has no right to assume that that guy would act as an agent for this particular matter. He just made that assumption because he's a known employee of the borrower. That is certainly not the same as an agent appointed in front of witnesses to be a legal recipient for conveying property or money to such a person. And that's how Rav Chisda explains that even if you handed it to the borrower's agent, he didn't receive it legally because this is not his legally appointed agent, it's just an employee. Now, the Gemara poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Chisda from the Mishnah here. We learned in the Mishnah, if the robber wishes to return the stolen item, he may not give the payment to the robbery victim's son to return it to the robbery victim, nor to his agent. So what kind of agent are we talking about? With regard to this agent of the robbery victim, what are the circumstances surrounding his appointment? If the Mishnah is discussing a case where the robbery victim did not appoint him as his agent in the presence of witnesses, how do we know that he was appointed as an agent? Rather, is it not discussing a case where the robbery victim appointed him as his agent in the presence of witnesses, and the robber nevertheless does not fulfill his obligation to return the stolen item by giving it to his agent? And the Gemara answers, Rav Chisda interpreted the ruling of the Mishnah with regard to his hired hand or his regular harvester, who do not require witnesses to validate their appointment as his agent, right? So Rav Chisda would say, when our Mishnah says you can't give it to his agent, it means the case of this hired hand, who we might assume is a valid agent, but is not. We haven't established whether the robber who atones after making a false statement is permitted to make restitution via a legally appointed agent, an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses. We don't know yet. So the Gemara asks, but with regard to an agent who the robbery victim appointed in the presence of witnesses, okay, what is the law? Would one say that indeed one appointed before witnesses is a legally recognized agent? If that is the case, instead of teaching in the latter clause of our Mishnah, right, our Mishnah here, Mishnah number 5 in chapter 9, which indicates, which said, but he may give the payment to an agent of the court. Okay, so we know he can give it to an agent of the court. Now, if our Mishnah says you can give it to an agent of the court, is that to the exclusion of an agent appointed by the robbery victim in the presence of witnesses or not? But he may give it to an agent of the court, which indicates that this is the only agent to whom he may give it. So let the Mishnah make a distinction within the case of an agent appointed by the robbery victim itself and teach. An agent who the robbery victim appointed in the presence of witnesses is indeed a legally recognized agent, but the Mishnah didn't say that. So if an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses is a legally recognized agent, why does our Mishnah shift to discuss an agent of the court? Why not, if that is possible, that the robbery victim could receive it through an agent that he appointed in front of witnesses, why didn't the Mishnah say so? Why did the Mishnah say you can only return it via an agent of the court? So the sages say in response, although the Tana of our Mishnah could have stated the case of an agent appointed by the robbery victim in the presence of witnesses, he could not have stated this law definitively. As, with regard to an agent of the court, there is no difference whether the robbery victim appointed him as an agent, i.e. the court appointed him at the behest of the robbery victim, and there is no difference whether the robber appointed him as an agent, meaning the court appointed him at the behest of the robber. In other words, for whom was it more convenient to use this agent of the court? Was it the robber who just can't get all the way to Medea and asked the court if he could deposit the restitution with an agent of the court, so that court appoints an agent? Or was it the robbery victim who said, listen, I'd like to get my money. I know this guy's not going to make it all the way to Medea, so could you appoint an agent for me who could receive it from me? So no matter which one makes the request, whether the robbery victim or the robber, if the request comes into the court and the court appoints the agent, valid agent. But if we say an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses, maybe it's the case that the robbery victim is permitted to appoint such an agent, but the robber is not permitted to appoint such an agent. And so, for stylistic and for purposes of being concise, the Tana who formulated our Mishnah just talked about an agent of the court, and not necessarily to the exclusion of an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses by the robbery victim. Maybe that is a valid way for him to receive his restitution. Right? Therefore, he, the Tana, could state the law concerning an agent of the court definitively. By contrast, with regard to an agent who was appointed in the presence of witnesses, that only when the robbery victim appointed him as an agent, he is an agent, but when the robber appointed him as an agent, he is not an agent, as the robber cannot appoint an agent to receive payment on behalf of the robbery victim. Therefore, the Tana could not have stated that definitively. He would have had to lay out both cases and say the robber can appoint an agent in the presence of witnesses, the robbery victim can appoint an agent in the presence of witnesses to receive the restitution, but the robber cannot appoint an agent even in the presence of witnesses to receive the payment on behalf of the robbery victim. So rather, the Tana was concise and say the only one that works is an agent of the court, but that doesn't mean that it won't work. So the Gemara comments, and this Mishnah, which rules that an agent of the court is an agent even if appointed only by the robber, meaning the robber requests the court to appoint such an agent, this serves to exclude the opinion of this following Tana. As it was taught in the Tosefta, the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, if there was an agent of the court who was appointed by the robbery victim, but not appointed by the robber, or an agent who was appointed by the robber, and subsequently the other, meaning the robbery victim, sent for and took his payment from the agent's possession, the robber is exempt from paying for any accidental damage to the payment during the delivery. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying that the robber is exempt from paying for any accidental damage once he gives the payment to a court agent that he requested that the court appoint, only if the robbery victim sent for and took possession of the payment. This is in opposition to the ruling of the Mishna that the robber would be exempt whenever he gives the payment to an agent of the court. So the Gemara cites the opinion of two other Amoraim, sages of the Gemara, with regard to the status of an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both say, an agent who was appointed in the presence of witnesses is a legally recognized agent. And if you say, our Mishnah contradicts this assertion, as it rules that the stolen item is not considered returned if it is given to an agent of the robbery victim, well, this is of no concern. And the Gemara explains, the Mishnah does not mean to disqualify an agent appointed by the robbery victim in the presence of witnesses, but rather is referring to a case where the robbery victim provides the robber with an agent without appointing him in the presence of witnesses, and that he says to someone, listen, I have money that is owed to me. It is currently with so-and-so, right, the robber who's ready to make restitution, but he's not sending it. So present yourself to him as perhaps he wishes to return it, but he cannot find a person with whom to send it. This is not only the robber who is ready to make restitution, but any borrower, right? So somebody borrowed money from me. He's in another city. He's really delayed in paying it back. But I'm not, assuming that he's trying to jilt me, right? He's not going to pay back. It's just been very inconvenient for him to get the money to me. He doesn't have a delivery person. I have a friend who happens to be traveling to that city. So I say to him, listen, that guy owes me money. Go ask him if he'd like you to deliver it to me, so maybe he'll pay me back via you. Was that an agent appointed in the presence of witnesses? No. Right? It's just I'm sort of establishing this as my agent for the convenience of the borrower, who it's his job to get the money to me. So what's the upshot? The guy might decide to send the money back through my friend who happens to be in that city, but since not a legally appointed agent, if my friend, drops the money and loses it, or absconds with it, or is robbed, or whatever, and the money never gets back to me, the borrower still has to make that good because the money never reached me. And the fact that my friend, he tried to use him as an agent to deliver it to me, doesn't matter that it's my friend. That was not a legal appointment of an agent to receive my loan for me. Where was I? Right. So the Gemara offers a second explanation. Alternatively, it is in accordance with the statement of Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda says, agent appointed in the presence of witnesses can receive the repayment, and once the robber gives it to him, or once a borrower gives it to him, it's delivered, legally considered delivered. So alternatively, it is in accordance with the statement of Rav Chisda that the Mishnah is not discussing a case where he appointed an agent in the presence of witnesses, but it is still known that the agent acts on behalf of the robbery victim, as the ruling of the Mishnah is stated with regard to the victim's hired hand or his regular harvester, i.e., not a legal agent. If you hand it to him, it might get to me, but you are not off the hook for getting it back to me. You're taking that risk. And that is why the robber is still liable after having given the payment to this hired hand who he assumed was a legal agent, but isn't. New subject. The Gemara discusses another matter relating to the appointment of an agent. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and now we're on 104b, one who owes a debt may not send money with another to the creditor on the basis of a figure, right? The word is deyokani, or a sign used in place of a signature that is associated with the creditor. The possession of this sign on the part of the other is not sufficient proof that he has been appointed as an agent. And this is the law even if witnesses verifying that this is the creditor's sign are signed on it. And Rabbi Yochanan says if there are witnesses signed on it, then one may send the money with the other, right? So in other words, I lend you some money. We have a secret code word between us, like some kind of a safe word, a code word, right? And then a guy shows up at your door and says, hey, Sal would love to get you to repay that loan. You can send it through me. And you're like, oh, well, that's convenient, but how do I know that you represent Sal? And then this guy comes up with the word that only you and I know about, the secret sign, right? And you're like, oh, okay, you really are from Sal. Here's the money. And then that guy disappears with the money. Have you repaid the loan? No, you have not. Because this sign by itself, one-step verification, not two-step verification. Talmud says you haven't paid. That was not good enough. If he showed up with a document that not only had the code word, but had witnesses sign that Sal gave that guy the code word, and that's why he's showing up at your door, then perhaps it would work. At least according to Rabbi Yochanan, it would work. But just the fact that he had the code word, not good enough. The sages say, according to Shmuel, what is the rectification? What recourse is available to one who wishes to collect a debt without traveling to the debtor's location? And the Gemara answers, one may act like that course of action of Rabbi Abba, who was owed money by Rav Yosef bar Kamma. And Rabbi Abba said to Rav Safra, when you come back from Rabbi Yosef bar Kamma's locale, bring my money to me. So when Rav Safra went there, Rava, who is Rav Yosef bar Kamma's son, said to him, did Rabbi Abba write you a document stating, I have received your payment so that my father will have proof that he has absolved himself of the debt? And Rav Safra said to him, no. And Rav responded, well, if so, first go to him and let him write you a document stating, I have received payment, and then my father will pay you. Right? So he wanted a receipt. Right? So the middleman is coming. Now, these are sages on all ends, right? The lender is a sage, the borrower is a sage, and the middleman is a sage. But even so, the borrower is being very careful. And the borrower's son, who's also a sage, says, listen, my father, we know you, we trust you, but we got to do this the right way. Dot every I, cross every T. So if we're going to put the money in your hand, we don't want that there's a risk that the money never reaches the principal, the lender, and then we still have to make good the loan again. We want that when we hand you the money, at that moment, our legal responsibility ends. The debt is paid. And the one who's undertaking the risk that the money won't reach the borrower is the borrower himself. And we want legal evidence of that. So if you want us to pay you the money, come back with a document that says the money is paid. Give us that document, we'll pay you the loan. Ultimately, Rava said to him, right? So Rav is the lender, right? Oh no, Rava is the borrower's son. So ultimately, Rava said to him, even if he writes you a document stating I have received payment, actually it is nothing. Since perhaps by the time you arrive back here, Rava will have died, and the money will fall before his orphans as an inheritance. And the document stating I have received payment that was written by Rabbi Abba will be nothing, as the debt is no longer owed to him, but rather to his heirs, right? So what this is about is that if you appoint an agent, even in the presence of witnesses, to go and collect a debt for you, and off he goes. But while he's on that journey to collect the money, the one who appointed him, the principal, in this case the lender, dies. So even though the middleman doesn't know, the agent doesn't know, his agency is canceled from the moment that his principal is dead. And when there is money owed to a lender and the lender dies, does the debt go away? Certainly not. The debt is still there, but the lender is now a different person. Who is it? The heirs of the original lender. So if he left a son, now the son is the lender. And this agency to collect the money on behalf of the original lender, the father who now is dead, that agency is canceled, right? And so it could work out later that even though they paid the debt to a duly appointed agent to collect it, but then he died, so the debt is considered not paid, and the son could later come and litigate and say, hey, I never received the money. You gave it to an agent, but my father was dead before you gave it to the agent, so that agency was canceled. You owe me, right? So that's what they're protecting against. So Rav Safra said to him, rather, what is the rectification? So Rava said, go, and Rabbi Abba will transfer to you the rights to that money that are owed to him by means of acquisition of land from him, and then you should come and write for us a document stating I have received payment, and then we will pay you. So essentially what Rav is saying to Rav Safra is, go back to Rabbi Abba, tell him to sell you the debt, right? You're not going to be an agent of Rabbi Abba. You're going to be the owner of the debt. He's going to sell it to you by way of an acquisition of land, right? So you're going to give him some piece of land. It's a token piece of land. Like you can actually sell him the threshold of your house, right? But it has to be tied to real property because you're selling an intangible item, which is the right to recover a debt. And the way that that can be done is to tie it to a piece of real property. So we're creating a legal fiction, but it's not a legal fiction, it's a legal mechanism, right? So what happens is you're going to buy the debt by giving him a little piece of land. You're going to come here. We're going to pay you the money because now you're the lender. We owe it to you. You can give a receipt. I've received payment. And then you'll go back and you'll give it to him and he'll give you back the ownership of that tiny piece of land. And the whole thing will work out. Obviously, it's the same elements, right? Money was land. A middleman's going to collect. He's going to bring it back to his principal. But because of the way the law works, it's not some kind of loophole. It's not some kind of clever workaround. It's the way that we have to do it. Not so much because, hey, we went through the niceties just to make it work and it wouldn't have otherwise. It's because this accounts for the problems that could arise through unforeseen circumstances. Really what we're dealing with is who bears the loss if the middleman loses the money, right? And this is a way that mechanism, this is a mechanism that will make it work. So the Gemara notes, and this is like that course of action of Rav Papa, who was owed 12,000 dinars by a resident of Bechozai. And he transferred his claim to that money to Rav Shmuel bar Abba by means of the acquisition of the threshold of his house, right? He didn't say, go collect it for me. He said, acquire the debt from me in return for a little piece of land. Go collect the money, and then when you come back, I'll sell it to you. And when Rav Shmuel bar Abba came from Bechozai with the money in hand, Rav Papa went out as far as Tavach, toured him because he was grateful and excited that this huge loan that he had extended was finally being paid off. New subject. The Mishnah teaches that if the robber gave the robbery victim the principal value of the stolen item, but did not give him the additional 1/5 payment required of a robber who also swore a false oath, or one who was caught without admitting it, so he is not required to pursue the robbery victim in order to return the additional 1/5 payment. And the Gemara comments, apparently the additional 1/5 payment is considered monetary restitution rather than a penalty, right? In this situation, it gets added on as a penalty, but once it's been added on, it's considered like the principal. It has that same status. And accordingly, if the robber died, the heirs of the robber must pay it to the robbery victim. Very interesting, right? So the heirs of the robber, a son can inherit from his father not only assets, but liabilities, at least against the estate. And we also learned in the Mishnah that if the robber gave the robbery victim the principal, and he takes a false oath to him concerning the additional 1/5 payment, asserting that he had already paid it, so the robber adds an additional 1/5 payment apart from the 1/5 about which he had taken a false oath. In other words, that became a new debt. He lied about that. So now he owes, that money plus another fifth, right? He admitted that he owed the principal. He didn't swear a false oath about that, but he did swear a false oath about that extra fifth. And then, is ready to atone for having lied about that. So he has to add a fifth to the fifth, right? So apparently, the additional fifth is monetary restitution, as one is obligated to pay a fifth on top of that if one takes a false oath with regard to monetary restitution, but not with regard to fines, meaning that the additional fifth becomes monetary restitution once it's added. And this is also taught in a baraisa with regard to one who robs another and takes a false oath to him that he did not rob him, and then he dies. His heirs pay the principal and the additional 1/5 payment to the robbery victim, but they are exempt from the obligation to bring the guilt offering. Now, did the heirs rob anybody? No. So why would they understood, okay, their father robbed someone and was ready to make restitution. So they're not going to keep this stolen money. They're going to give that back. Why do they have to add an additional fifth? The heirs didn't rob anyone. The children of the robber didn't rob anyone. But that additional fifth became part and parcel of the principal that was owed as restitution. So the heirs have to pay that too. They don't also inherit the obligation to bring a guilt offering. That was only their father, the robber. Now the Gemara asks, but are heirs obligated to pay the additional fifth of their father? Indicating that apparently the additional fifth is monetary restitution, and therefore the heirs must pay it? But one could raise a contradiction from a baraisa. After having stated that one is required to add the additional fifth only for a robbery he commits himself, and not for a robbery committed by his father, the baraisa states, I would still say that when does an heir not pay the additional fifth for his father's robbery? It is only when neither he nor his father took a false oath. But if he took a false oath, but not his father, what false oath did he take? He could swear a false oath that he had already paid this restitution, or he had already paid the additional fifth. Or if his father took a false oath, but not the heir. Or if he and his father both took false oaths. From where is the heir's exemption derived? And the verse states, he shall restore the item that he robbed, and the item that he has acquired through exploitation. And in this case, the heir did not rob, and the heir did not exploit. Since the verse states the obligation to pay the additional fifth when discussing one who robbed or exploited another, and the heir has done neither, he is exempt from payment. So this baraisa states that heirs are not obligated in the additional fifth. But you just said they were. So the Gemara answers, Rav Nachman said, this is not difficult. La kasha. Here in the Mishnah and the first baraisa, they discuss a case where the robber admitted his obligation and therefore was required to pay the additional fifth, and this obligation is transferred to his heir. There, in the latter baraisa, it discusses a case where the robber did not admit his obligation and was never required to pay the additional 1/5. Remember, the additional fifth of a robber kicks in when he denies that he robbed it, swore a false oath, and then admits it. Right? Now, the Gemara rejects this answer. If the latter baraisa discusses a case where he never admitted his obligation, then the law would be that the heir would not pay even the principal, as the obligation is not known by anyone. And if you would say that indeed it is so that he does not pay the principal, but isn't it understood from the fact that the Tana searches for a source to teach the heir's exemption for only from the additional fifth, that it means to say that he does pay the principal? So the Gemara also proves that the heir must pay the principal from the continuation of the same baraisa. And further, it is taught in that baraisa, and I would still say, when does the heir pay the principal for his father's robbery? It is only when he and his father both took false oaths. But if the father took a false oath and the heir did not, or if he took a false oath but not his father, or if neither he nor his father took false oaths, from where is the heir's obligation to pay the principal derived? And the verse states the following items: robbery, exploitation, lost item, and deposit. And there is a derivation here to derive that the heir is obligated to pay the principal in all of these cases. And the Gemara clarifies, and Rav Huna sat and stated this law, and Rabbah, his son, said to him, was the master saying that there is a derivation, or was the master saying that they will be paid? Rav Huna said to him, I am saying there is a derivation, right, from these extraneous terms in the verse teaching the obligation of a robber who swore a false oath and then admitted it. That since it's sort of redundant terms in that verse, we can extend that obligation to his heir. So there is a derivation, and it is from the additional expressions in the verses that I say it can be derived. And it is apparent that an heir is obligated to pay the principal, and this refutes Rav Nachman's attempted resolution. So rather, what did Rav Nachman mean when he suggested that the second baraisa is referring to a case where he did not admit his obligation and thus exempts his heir from paying the additional 1/5, but does obligate his heir to pay the principal? The baraisa is referring to a case where the father did not admit, but his son did admit, and therefore he's obligated to pay the principal. Now, the Gemara asks, and let his son be liable to pay the additional 1/5 for his own false oath. And the sages say, in the case of the baraisa, it is where the stolen item no longer exists. Although the false oath was taken, it is not the type of obligation for which one must pay an additional 1/5 payment. Because even if the son swears a false oath, he's not the original robber. So if the original property is still there and he swore a false oath, okay, he has to return that and add a 1/5. But if the original property is gone, we don't extend the obligation to replace it to the son, even though he swore a false oath. And the Gemara asks, if in the case of the baraisa, it is where the stolen items are no longer extant, right? They no longer exist. So the law should be that the heir does not even pay the principal, as the law is that while heirs must return an item stolen by their father, they are not obligated to compensate the owner if the item is no longer extant. Okay, if you have in your possession something that your father stole, you have to give it back. But if your father, lost it, destroyed it, consumed it, you don't have to make that up. That was your father's theft, not yours. So the Gemara answers, no. The ruling is necessary in a case where there is guaranteed property, i.e. land, which the heirs inherited from the robber. Heirs are obligated to compensate the owner of a stolen item with inherited land, even if the stolen item itself is no longer extant. You are on the hook if you have an estate that includes land. And the Gemara asks, and even when there is guaranteed property, meaning land, what of it? After all, such a debt is legally considered a loan by oral agreement, and the creditor of a loan by oral agreement cannot collect from the heirs of the debtor, nor can he collect from those who purchased the land from the debtor, right? Loan by oral agreement doesn't, survive the death of the borrower. So the sages say in response, the reference here, now we're on page 105a, I'm almost done. If you got questions or comments, please get them in now. So the reference here is to a case in which the father had already stood trial and was obligated to pay. So in such a case, the debt is considered like a loan with a promissory note, which a creditor may collect from the debtor's heirs. And the Gemara rejects this. If it is a case in which the father had already stood trial and was obligated to pay, then the heir who took a false oath and later confessed would have to pay even the additional 1/5, as well as this would be akin to any monetary obligation. But the baraisa rules that he is obligated to pay only the principal. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said the heir is exempt because one does not pay the additional 1/5 for the denial of a debt that is secured by a lien on land. And Rava said a different explanation. With what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the stolen item is still extant, and yet the heir is exempt because his father's sack containing the stolen item was deposited in the possession of others. So accordingly, the heir pays the principal since the stolen item is extant, but he does not pay the additional 1/5 payment because when he took an oath that it was not in his possession, he took an oath truthfully as he did not know that his father had stolen the item. Isn't it amazing the many, many layers of nuance and sophistication to this creditor, borrower, areas of borrower-lender law, robbery and restitution, also the laws of lost items, the nuances of one who swore an oath or didn't swear an oath. We might have thought that, all these kinds of incredible technical legalities that you need high-powered lawyers just to understand what's being agreed to when a contract is being signed, that's somehow an aspect of modern living. But, 2,000 years ago, they weren't so sophisticated like we are. Okay, let's get some questions. Joe, if a thief returns an item to the victim face to face, does it not affect the chance for apology and forgiveness to clear the table in preparation for the high holy days? You're saying in a positive way, right? Like that's what you want. I mean, that's definitely the ideal scenario. I guess what they're saying here about giving it to an agent, even an agent of the court or an agent appointed by the robbery victim in the presence of witnesses. Why would you make use of such an agent? Probably because that's the only way to get the money back to the victim. Travel, different cities, war-torn border. I mean, who knows? But certainly, it would seem that the basic intent of our Mishnah is that this guy who wants to make an atonement does have to go to the robbery victim and see him face to face and ask, for forgiveness as well as giving it back. And that would, I'm sure, help him out a lot. When Yom Kippur comes along and he's trying to make atonement and penance for everything, if he made it good during the year, he's not going to have to go seek him out again. So certainly that helps. And not just achieving an emotional piece, but achieving an actual atonement. Tom, do they ever get around to acknowledging the difference between a debtor and a robber? The debtor has done nothing wrong, or is it kal v'chomer? If we require this for a debtor, then all the more so for a robber who swore a false oath. Right. I mean, not every issue is worked out within the law of robbery and victim, so they're borrowing concepts from debtor and lender, but they're being pretty careful to say, do we know that if this works for debtor-lender, that it will also work for robber and victim? Not necessarily, right? So they definitely are drawing the distinction. Probably you asked the question a little bit earlier when we were going on and on and on about lenders and debtors, but we did make it back to the robber and victim. Ifa, if the son of a robber swears a false oath, believing at the time that it was a true oath, depending on his father's lies, the son still considered as having sworn a false oath? It's a great question. I was thinking about the same thing. Is that really a false oath? It turns out to be false. But he thought he was telling the truth. He had no awareness. And that's why we have to be so careful when we're transmitting, debts and obligations to make restitution, from, one generation to the next. Because, I know a lot about what my father does and doesn't do, but, do I know everything? Not remotely, All of us have that situation. We don't know what our parents have done. We don't know their histories. We weren't around them all the time. So there's lots of situations where we wouldn't know, and we won't know. Perhaps, somebody loses a parent and he was owed a lot of money, and then he dies, and the borrower says, oh, great, now I don't have to pay back, but he does have to pay back. But that's why they make these very careful distinctions of if you're going to try to collect from an estate, right, and to collect from the orphans of somebody who lost a parent, you're going to have a much higher requirement of evidence for that obligation before the estate on behalf of the orphans is going to have to cough up dough, and as rightly so. And Lucy says, do the sages assume that the heir is complicit? No. I mean, we've been talking about cases where, there's a false oath by the son. There's no assumption that the son would swear a false oath. It's just that they're asking, if the obligation to pay back was transmitted from a robber to his son, but the son never swore a false oath, so he's not going to have to pay the fifth. But what if the son did swear a false oath? And what is the nature of that false oath? Saying, oh, my dad paid it already. I know he paid. Or, I paid it already. I'm from the estate. And then he regrets. Not because we can prove that the oath was false, but because he admits it. Having sworn falsely and then admitting it, that's when this payment kicks in. Proving that an oath was false is a different matter, and there's not necessarily an obligation to pay, even if it's proven that he was false. And maybe this answers Aoife's question, because he could say, well, I didn't know it was false. I wasn't swearing falsely on purpose, right? Where the obligation to pay the fifth kicks in is where he admits he swore a false oath. All of this was predicated on a robber who stole, swore a false oath, and then atones, regrets, repents, and wants to make it good. That's why he has to add the fifth. If we prove that it was false, but he doesn't admit it, it might be that he didn't know he was swearing falsely. Right, and what is this? Joseph says, is all this discussion centered on face-to-face restitution or getting close to it, as close to it as possible so that the restitution is trusted to happen? And Tom answered, I think it's an extra responsibility imposed on the robber for not just robbing, but for also lying about it. Yes, just so. Right, so we don't necessarily require that face-to-face restitution simply for one who has to pay back a loan or even a robber who was caught. But for one who lied about stealing and now is ready to repent, he needs to go face-to-face. And it's almost like a service that we're doing to the one who's repenting to make that requirement so that when he completes that mission, he can say, okay, I stole, I lied about it, I swore that the lie was true. What was I thinking? I want to make it good. So now he's returned the principal, he's given the fifth, and he did it face to face. So now he's good, right? So it's beautiful to create a mechanism where one can make an atonement and know that he's completed his atonement. That is a mercy and a kindness from God, to all of us, that this mechanism exists because people make mistakes. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday at the regular time.